Great, thank you. All right, I guess we're at time, so I'll just kick things off. I'm Aaron Parecki. Excited to talk about OAuth 2.1 today. The rough agenda of today, I want to start with some background on what OAuth 2.1 is, talk about some of the motivation and background on it, and then we'll get to the updates, starting with some of the recent changes that have happened over the last several months, over the last few meetings. In particular, I want to talk about some of the issues that were discussed at the last interim meeting, and then talk about some of the plan changes, and then there'll probably be some time for discussion because there are a lot of open topics still, and I would love to get some feedback from anybody here. So some of the background on what this effort is. I'm sure many of or most of us here are familiar with OAuth 2.0, which started off as OAuth 2 core with the idea of course, bearer tokens being split out into a different draft. And the problem, or some of the original things about original OAuth 2 core made it kind of awkward or not ideal, or left open some holes for apps that were emerging, app types that were emerging at the time the spec was created. So single page apps and mobile apps were relatively new ideas at the beginning of when OAuth 2 was created. So there were things developed to address those use cases, like PKCE, for example. So as a separate RFC, this mechanism of protecting the authorization code was, originally it was like, oh, this is for mobile because mobile can't use a client secret. And that was also described in another RFC, specifically talking about mobile apps. And then one of the other more recent efforts is to create sort of a companion to the mobile app best practices, but for single page apps, because it turns out that a lot of the things in browsers have also changed compared to how it worked over 10 years ago when OAuth was created. So we no longer have the limits of older browsers that are unable to use cross-origin resource sharing, and it is in fact quite common to use this now in most things on the internet, thankfully. So cores basically means that browsers can use the authorization code flow, whereas previously they were not able to. And what that essentially means is that the implicit flow has no purpose anymore. The implicit flow is, of course, a workaround for the lack of ability for browsers to make post requests. So we don't need any more. Great. That's one of the things that's talked about in the browser app BCP. It also goes over a couple of design patterns for using OAuth in a browser. The sort of two main patterns being if the browser really is its own client, standalone client, where it is the one making requests directly to the authorization server using, cross-origin domain, cross-domain requests and all that stuff. Where the JavaScript is served from a static web host. And then the sort of other way of looking at it is if you actually are using a single page app framework, but you also have the ability to deploy an application server behind it, turning the application server into the OAuth client means you can treat it like a confidential client, and you actually avoid a lot of the issues that are inherent in dealing with JavaScript apps in a browser. Anyway, that's all wrapped up in the browser app best current practice document, along with this recommendation of using PKCE in browsers. Separately, there's still ongoing work of the security best current practice, which talks about all kinds of apps. And that one is, again, making sort of fixing up and bringing up to current security standards the rest of the OAuth space. So it does things like talks about, please use PKCE, please don't use the implicit grant, don't even use the password grant, because that's not even really OAuth at the end of the day. And it goes one step further and recommends PKCE even if you do have a client secret, because there is still a potential for an authorization code injection attack if you're not using PKCE. So that's great. And then it also goes and talks about, okay, well, RFC 6750 talks about using access tokens and query strings, which is not a good idea. So let's stop doing that as well. Basically, it's getting at a bunch of the things that were in the original documents and fixing them up and bringing them up to modern standards. So some of the text from the security BCP, this is a paragraph that talks about the password grant, taking that out. And it is, that's because the I guess two main reasons. The rest of this is, it's very dense text, but it explains why. But essentially it's sharing the password with the OAuth client, which was the original goal of OAuth, was to avoid doing that. But it's also just very limiting now when we're trying to do things like add multi-factor auth or additional kinds of authentication beyond passwords. So it doesn't really have a place in the spec anymore. So the security BCP, the summary of things that it includes, this is the most brief summary of what's in the security BCP, is all OAuth clients use PKCE with the authorization code flow, kind of just baking it in, avoiding the password grant. Redirect URIs need to be exact string matching now, whereas the original spec gave more wiggle room in that. No access tokens and query strings. Limitations on refresh tokens for public clients, either making them sender constrained in some way or making them one-time use or rotating them. So at this point, what we've got with OAuth is a collection of a whole bunch of different specs that talk about what is the best way to do OAuth right now. And you have to read a lot of documents to actually figure that out. And if you actually look at what this collection of documents describes, it's adding a few things and taking out a few things, and what's left is actually a much simpler picture. So what we've really got is authorization code flow with PKCE. We've taken out a few grants, and then we've got a few ways to use access tokens. And this is really the idea of what OAuth 2.1 is trying to do. So it's meant to update it's meant to really collect and consolidate what we know of today as the people who are deep in the OAuth space as the best way to do OAuth. So it is adding best practices, removing deprecated features. It's really meant to just kind of snapshot and roll up what we've got today as the best way to do OAuth. Another opportunity we have here is to do things like cleaning up references, both removing references to other outdated specs that have been replaced, updating those, adding references to extensions that didn't exist when OAuth was created. There's a lot of new work being done in the OAuth space that is absolutely worth mentioning and referencing in OAuth 2.1 and making people aware of, even if it doesn't mean rolling it into the core. And speaking of that, one of the fundamental non-goals of OAuth 2.1 is that it is not actually defining new things. So it's not changing, it's not adding in totally new features. It is consolidating what is currently known as the best practice of OAuth. So that means that there's a handful of even RFCs that are not being brought into it because they are either brand new or not yet widely implemented. So those are still left as extensions of OAuth, and we may, we're adding references to them so people are aware of them, but they're not being rolled into it. So OAuth 2.1 is essentially consolidating the core, the native apps best current practice, PKCE browser-based apps, and the security best current practice, as well as the bearer token spec. So it's defining effectively just two grant types, authorization code, and PKCE just sort of becomes part of it. It's not really mentioned as PKCE anymore. And then client credentials, which of course still has plenty of uses and doesn't really have any issues there. And then it does actually place a lot of these restrictions on how you do these various things that may have been optional or flexible in core. So we are currently at draft 4, published just last month, or technically 2 months ago now. And we've gone through a couple of iterations of this based on feedback and discussions over the last interim meetings, which have all been virtual. So I want to go over a couple of the most recent changes compared to earlier versions of the draft. We've had a couple of contributors that are outside of the editor group, which is fantastic, and doing things like taking all the list of errata from the core draft and incorporating those into the spec, which is awesome. Fixing up some of the examples of the code samples and request samples and things like that. There was a big reorganization of section 4, which is it was kind of split between the different parts of the draft originally, but this whole section 4 is now all about the token endpoint request. So the token endpoint is like, here is what you need to do when you're making a token endpoint request, and here's the different options. There's still the second to last bullet point is still ongoing, but there's a lot of things in security considerations of the various drafts that are part of this that are actually normative text. And one of the goals we're trying to do is move all the normative stuff into the actual document, not just leave it in the security considerations. So we're trying to make it so that the security considerations are really just considerations, not actually requirements. And then one of the most recent things that we talked about in the last interim meeting was actually explicitly mentioning the removal of response type token. So in the first version of this, we basically just deleted the whole section about the implicit grant, leaving it out completely, which did open up some questions or led to some possible confusion. So there is now a new section in there that explicitly says, why this was removed and that it doesn't affect other extensions that may have been extending response type in other ways. So some of the recent discussions that have happened, there is this other this other aspect we've been trying to clean up in the core is this definition of client types. The core draft defines public and confidential clients, public clients being clients that can't be deployed with a client secret or any other credentials, and confidential clients which can. Typically that ends up being you're running an app on a server where you can deploy config stuff and it's secret, versus a mobile app or a single page app where you can't ship secrets in those. There is some sort of middle ground or gray area between the two. And one of those has been called out in the original draft in several places. The idea is to give it a name, which is credentialed client. And if you look at draft in OAuth 2, it'll say things like if the client type is confidential or the client was issued client credentials. And the idea would be to remove all of those, consolidate that wording to be naming it credentialed clients. So the idea is that a credentialed client has credentials, but its identity is not confirmed the way that you would consider it to be confirmed by deploying credentials at like build configuration time. So I guess probably the most straightforward example of this would be a client like a mobile app that after you download it the first time it boots up, it goes and uses dynamic client registration to get a secret. And it has a secret then, but it's not a confidential client because it wasn't deployed with that secret. So you can't trust the client's identity, but you can use the secret for other things in the flow. There is, however, an ongoing discussion right now about whether this distinction is actually helpful in the document and whether it makes sense to keep this term or just sort of revert back to public and confidential with all these exceptions in the draft. I think part of the challenge is particularly defining exactly what it means to be to have the client's identity not confirmed, or whether that's the right way to phrase it, or whether it needs to be some other definition of what it means if a client can have credentials but isn't. Those credentials were given to it at runtime that in a way that I can't even describe it without using that language. So that's open for discussion. That's ongoing. And then a couple of the issues at the previous interim that I wanted to call out in particular, some of these have been resolved, some of these are still ongoing. One of the more recent drafts is this adding in this ISS response parameter. So that is it's its own standalone draft. It's actually going through the publication process right now. And the security BCP is also recommending using this, but this is basically if your client does talk to multiple authorization servers, there's a potential mix-up attack possibility. And this this would solve the, what happened to my slides? My computer just, am I still here?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Okay, you can't see my slides though, right?
The slides are on the page ISS response parameter.
That's really bizarre. On my end, my computer looks like it is asleep.
Oh.
Okay. Well, I think if it's working, I can get through the rest of these slides because I can see my slides on a different screen. We'll see how this goes.
Okay, let's try it.
Let's try that, and then I will figure out later what is going on. So the discussion here was whether to incorporate this parameter in OAuth 2.1. Some of the reasons to do it would be that it is relatively straightforward. It is a pretty simple mechanism on both the client and server implementation. But the reasons not to is that it is a very new mechanism. So, and that was one of the goals of OAuth 2.1 is to not include new things. So the sort of consensus after the meeting was to not pull it in now, but revisit this once it is an RFC. So then we can discuss it, because then at least it's at least stable at that point. One of the other topics was requiring HTTPS redirect URLs. Can you see that slide now? It says require HTTPS redirect URLs.
No, it seems that your slides are stuck at the ISS.
Slides are stuck. Okay. That is too bad. What in the world is going on? I am worried that the only way to fix this is to reboot my computer, and I don't like that idea.
You do see your mouse moving when you move it. We see your cursor on the screen.
Okay, did it change slides?
No. It's on the top left-hand side of the screen, but it's not changing slides.
Is this doing anything?
No.
Nope. Wow, what a mess. I don't understand what's going on.
Maybe try stop sharing screen.
I can't see my computer. I can't use Zoom.
Maybe
like
the host can stop you sharing.
Yeah, you know what I can do is, like, I have another laptop here. I'll just join from my other laptop and see if I can get back in. That is so bizarre. I've never had this happen before. Okay, if this works.
Recording in progress.
Got it.
So figure out how to stop screen sharing. I think I don't have host capabilities.
Okay, I might be able to. Okay, at least I can see myself in the other computer now. And I can see my mouse moving. This is fascinating. Okay. Oh, hey, it changed.
Yes, we can see require HTTPS redirect UIs.
And my computer is back. I can see it now again. This is so weird. Okay. That was bizarre. Sorry about that. Okay, requiring HTTPS redirect URLs. So essentially there was a couple of exceptions carved out in the core draft that because in 2010 and 2012, like, HTTPS was not super easy to deploy. So the new proposal was to just require it for URLs, with the exception of course, loopback and custom URL schemes. Everybody agreed on this one. Was not very, not a lot of discussion. So that is going into the next version. Then this one is more complicated. So as we were going through a lot of the comments and other discussions and looking through issues, there were a lot of things that were like specifically there because of the risk of authorization code replays. So things like single-use authorization codes. One of the reasons for doing that is because you want to make sure that you can't have an authorization code be stolen and then be used by somebody. PKCE definitely helps prevent that. And we do know in practice, there are some implementations that don't enforce the single use requirement anyway. There's another question, this marked as 82, which is if an authorization code is used in a request, but other parts of the request are not valid, should that also invalidate the authorization code, or should it be allowed to be used if the request was fixed? And then there's also the redirect URL that goes in the token request, which is, it's there again to prevent a mix-up attack, but PKCE solves that aspect of it better. So the proposal here was, can we get rid of some of the complicated things that are either hard to enforce on the server or extra hoops the client has to jump through in favor of using PKCE because PKCE is built in? This one ended up being, let's say, a little bit more of a discussion going on. So very long thread kicked off on the mailing list, a lot of discussion here, and by no means was there a resolution at all on this. So I think the thing here is we're going to have to break it up and talk about these more individually, because I do think that, for example, the redirect URL, I feel like it serves zero purpose at this point of including that in the token request, whereas I do see that there are other things that having single-use authorization codes do solve, even if some people aren't enforcing that today. So that is still an ongoing discussion, and we should feel free to, we can talk about that later in the session as well. Next steps, what's happening next? There are, based on the last meeting, there's some changes that we are now planning to put in the next draft that are not yet incorporated in the, or not yet published, even if they're in the sort of the GitHub working copy. But one of the, I think, really good ideas that came out of that session was making like a complete list of all of the significant changes from OAuth 2. So that would be making that list from the perspective of building each component. So that would be like listing out, if you're building an authorization server and you were previously supporting OAuth 2, here's the things to change to bring you up to speed, and same with clients and things like that. Justin and Vittorio have done, now it was a while ago, they've written up very thorough reviews, and that's what's been influencing a lot of these changes and this discussion. Still working through all that feedback, and we're down to now the last sort of back end of it. There's going to be a chunk of stuff to discuss around desktop environments once we get into that feedback. And then there's also just a bunch of issues open on the spec, either because they were issues that required more discussion based on those two reviews, or just other people have chimed in now on GitHub to actually open up new discussion topics. So there's a lot of open stuff to resolve. So this is the link to the GitHub repo where we're working on this, and please feel free to join there, or of course on the mailing list. The mailing list being the official on the record place to discuss this, but otherwise, we would love to have your opinions on this. So that's that's all I've got for the update, the prepared content. Would happy to take questions, and also if anybody has opinions about the sort of open items I called out, I'm happy to hear more about that here, and maybe we can work through some of those. So yeah, thanks. Oh, I see Mike has his hand up.
And I'm asking the question, what would Jose do? I just wanted to comment on the single use of the authorization code. I understand that there's some mitigations for that, even if it's multi-use, but at least from my personal point of view, that's defense in depth. There's a whole class of attacks that can't occur if the authorization code can't be reused. And so I think, given we're trying to up the security, I would be loath to see it go away.
Yeah, I think I'm in favor of that too. I think what's maybe spun this discussion the wrong way was trying to group all of these. Yeah, where the like 54, for example, has nothing to do with authorization codes. It's only related in that it is a mix-up attack mitigation strategy, and PKCE is also. So I think I think it's now worth talking about these individually, because I agree that I agree with the single use requirement personally, and there's very clearly not a consensus on that issue in either direction.
Sure. Okay, and thank you again for doing this. I'll just say before I mute myself again.
Thanks. It has been fun to get a chance to go through and clean up a lot of the stuff. Honestly, there's it's kind of interesting to see the way things were written 10 years ago, and there's just a there's a lot of different ways that we just talk about stuff now in the spec space. Roger, do you want to read that on mic, or do you want me to read it out? I'll just read it out. Roger says, would almost single use be good enough? It's quite tricky and expensive to guarantee a single use semantic. Yeah, it totally depends on the deployment, because in some deployments that are smaller scale, single use is very easy to do, and in very large ones, it's potentially very challenging. And that's the reason that I know that there are deployments that don't have that single use requirement, and instead they are mostly single use, or they're very short time window in which the replay is possible. And I think it's looking like, I guess the other way to deal with that issue is the core spec says they have to be single use right now. And the other way to think about it is to like explicitly call out the fact that some people don't do that, and there are challenges with it. So I don't know what the right balance there is to do, because it's one thing to have a spec say make a requirement, and it's another thing to then just have people ignore it. So I don't know. It's I don't know what the right balance is there. Oh, I missed this other question from the chat. From Dimitri, is it implied that hybrid should be deprecated as well? The actual text from the security BCP and what's in 2.1 deprecates issuing tokens in the authorization response. So that's the part that's not allowed, because you can't prevent all of the problems with a token being sent in the front channel. Even if it's sent as a post request, there's still potential leakage issues. So the 2.1 is not doing anything with regards to response type ID token. That's the one that's called out in that paragraph. The response type ID token is its own thing with its own considerations and other strategies. But OAuth is not defining the concept of response type, including token. So that's the one being taken out. I don't remember all of the combinations of hybrid modes. They seem very complicated. But any of them that are including token would not be part of 2.1.
Hybrid mostly lets you get the ID token on the front channel and the access and refresh tokens on the back channel.
Yeah, that's the response type ID token code. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that one's, again, like, that's an extension of the response type code, and that, so it's totally fine. Yeah.
Correct, I believe. Thank you.
Yeah, add a text suggesting something along the lines of single use or other mitigation. The choosing those words is the part that is very challenging. And that's what's, there's a lot of discussion on the list right now, this thread, about exactly that. So I think that's the thing to drill in on right now, is what exactly is that phrasing? It's going to make everybody happy. I don't think we found it yet.